Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. We now live in a newly established battleground. The New Orleans area became the target this week of an initiative to battle opioids, heroin, and related drugs. We'll examine the battle plans, as well as more accusations in the clergy sex scandals. On the brighter side, the New Orleans Advocate won a Pulitzer Prize. We will look at the winning investigation and its impact on local laws. And the tragic fire in Paris brings to mind the destruction by flames of historic buildings in New Orleans history, including one fire that took place on a Good Friday. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources, John Zimmerman, reporter, The New Orleans Advocate, and Ramon Antonio Vargas, reporter, The New Orleans Advocate. And we're going to stay with Ramon right now because you covered an announcement this week. The DEA has recognized Orleans Parish, Jefferson, and St. Bernard parishes, right, as part of what it's calling the 360 strategy to combat the growing, increasing use of opioids, an opioid problem. We're seeing opioid overdoses and deaths. So what do they plan to do with this?
A lot of the ideas that were kind of discussed at the announcement have all kind of been discussed before. You're talking about preventing addiction by talking to school kids about the consequences and dangers of abusing prescription medication and just drugs in general. On the opposite end of the spectrum, kind of the stick approach would be the on the law enforcement side, right? Continuing to prosecute street level drug dealers a lot of the times who kind of protect their trade by through gun violence, and then also in doctors' offices trying to prevent and punish and prosecute overprescription of opioids and so-called pill mill clinics, right? Neither of those neither of those approaches are necessarily new. It's just that I think the idea is to kind of marshal the resources and the presence and really kind of the organizational muscle of three parish government and law enforcement apparatuses to kind of join the federal efforts in doing that. It's light on a lot of specifics on the various funding sources, and it was kind of light on specifics on kind of local partner organizations. When I looked into the website that was kind of set up as part of this 360 initiative, you're looking at groups like Boy Scouts of America and the Elks organization and Boys and Girls Clubs, who kind of been doing some of this work, I think, already.
Well, it seems like the idea, and looking at that press announcement the other day, there were a lot of people standing there at the podium who were coming in one by one. But it brings in, it's a multi-parish, a three-parish area, and all of the local governmental agencies and law enforcement groups, judicial groups, et cetera, but also faith-based organizations, civic organizations, educational systems. It's sort of, all hands on deck.
Yes, and obviously I think trying to connect addicts as opposed to prosecute them, to connect them either to counseling services, faith-based organizations that can kind of help treat the problem that they may be grappling with. And I think the idea is to make these approaches, kind of take ideas that have been tried before and make them less fragmented. I feel that the fragmentation, and you see that these fragmented efforts from before have been less successful.
Could you give us a quick primer here? What distinguishes opioids from other forms of narcotics?
The idea that you see your addicts are introduced to them because they're trying to treat pain, or they're trying to treat they're trying to recover from a surgery, and end up becoming addicted to a drug that they were legally provided to. And then because of shortage of resources or maybe a lack of knowledge of where you can find treatment, start turning to street drugs or going to pill mills to try to kind of get that. And I think that and it cuts across socioeconomic classes and socioeconomic backgrounds to where very wealthy and people, as well as people on the opposite end of the socioeconomic spectrum, are afflicted by it.
And something very touching. There was even the St. Bernard sheriff saying
Yes.
that he experienced his own family with his
He lost his son, too.
Lost his son to, and obviously just the last point I'll make, the kind of the statistic that kind of really drives home the I guess the whole national epidemic is the idea that gun violence deaths in New Orleans for the past 3 years, where they have been relatively high for many years, have been outpaced by the number of opioid overdose deaths.
Yeah, and it's been something doctors, and certainly in emergency rooms, have been saying. And speaking of doctors, the coroner for Jefferson Parish, Jerry Townovich, was there at the press conference. And if you live in Jefferson Parish, you probably have received in the mail, as I did, a mailer to remind voters about the millage renewal for the coroner's office, which is coming up in May. And in this, though, is this statistic, which we've heard Dr. Vitanovich talk about over and over again. Look at this. Drug overdose up 34% over the past 5 years. This is Jefferson Parish now. Opioid deaths, 36% since 2014. That's an enormous number, and that's just horrifying. And, of course, one big issue, a big factor in this is fentanyl. Which, is highly deadly, really very, very dangerous. And so, this is a problem that we're seeing as well.
Yes, and you've seen also those first response agencies have tried to do what they can to limit by arming people with Narcan. Their first responders with Narcan, which reverse the effects of overdoses.
Right, and then also, family members, or they can go to, I think, the University Medical Center, or perhaps go to a physician and get some assistance in keeping that on hand if they know someone has a heroin problem or opioid problem. Well, this is something that really is a problem facing not just the nation, but certainly here within our community. And so we'll certainly be looking for the resources that this DEA 360 strategy will bring to combat this problem.
Yes, some summits later in the year to, I think, bring in more kind of local stakeholders. So we'll see what effects they have on the battle. All
right, thanks a lot, Ramon. Pelicans, Errol, there have been some changes there that people are hopeful that this will really be a big change, turnaround for the team.
Yeah, they've brought in someone who seems to have high respect around the league. He's someone who started off as a kid. He's from Phoenix, and he worked with as an intern. He did work with the NBA franchise with the Suns, and then worked his way up and got into the professional level and at the managerial level, and wound up with the Cleveland Cavaliers. And the year they won their championship, he was the guy who put the deal together. Now, getting Aaron James on the team helped a lot, but he seems to be very, very impressive, and people feel really good about it. The national press seem to be praising that this guy is like the big catch that people wanted. And he announced that he was bringing Coach Gentry back, which I think was a good choice. He'd worked with Gentry before, and so there's at least that level of continuity. The big kind of surprise is that it was kind of hinting around that there's a possibility of Anthony Davis coming back too after all of this. He was asked about Davis, and he says he'd already talked to Davis's agent. He knows the agent, and he knows Davis. And he didn't say no. I guess that was the main thing. He says he wanted to talk to him and see if there was a commitment that he really had to believe in it, and so that could be part. This could be the kind of guy that could do that. And so after the terrible way that the season, it's really interesting. Like 2 weeks ago, the whole Pelican season ended, and everybody was just so mad and disappointed. And this week was so upbeat, and now there's a feeling in the future. But one thing he pointed out was that what really impressed him was Gail Benson, that he felt like she had the commitment to really bring the team back. So.
And his name, David Griffin?
David Griffin.
David Griffin. And also, it represents an organizational change, really, within the Saints and the Pelicans, because Mr. Griffin will just oversee the Pelicans, and Loomis will now just oversee the Saints. Is that correct?
Mickey Loomis is kind of overseeing both operations at the higher level, the football and the basketball levels. As people said, you need to have a basketball person that's running the basketball level. And you certainly can't criticize the job that Mickey Loomis has done on the football level. Had it not been for the thing with Anthony Davis, the Pelicans still might have made the playoffs, and so it's not like that they were that bad of a team or badly managed. They just had some bad breaks in the past year, like when Boogie Cousins got hurt. So they just had some bad things. But if somebody can build a solid team, I guess the thing is that there's a feeling that there's hope for this franchise. Now, I think from the very beginning, there was a feeling that maybe New Orleans can't support an NBA team, and there were some lean years, and this year being a disappointment. But certainly, I mean, the comments that Gail Benson has made, I mean, she's just been unequivocal that she's supporting the team, and the team's going to stay here. And this new team seems like one that's saying the right things.
Right, she seems to be extremely supportive and dedicated to the team and to New Orleans having the NBA here. So, all righty, thanks a lot. John, congratulations to you guys. I mean, this is really a really big honor, a big deal for a newspaper to be awarded the Pulitzer, and you guys were, you and your team. It was Gordon and Jeff. And
Gordon and Jeff and Dan Swenson on graphics, and Walt Handelsman did a great animation for us. And yeah, it's a thrill. It's a great recognition for all the work we've been doing at the Advocate. It's the first Pulitzer in 177 years for the Advocate. That's on one side, and then in the New Orleans operation, which we just started up 5.5 years ago, it's pretty nice to, to reward all of our work. Guys like Ramon, Ramon in particular, actually, who, when we break off reporters to do these projects, you're taking a lot of firepower out of a very small newsroom, and it all falls on Ramon,
and
who's
what doesn't he cover is the question.
Ridiculously good cops reporter and everything else. So yeah, I mean it's really a newsroom effort when you do something like that.
So let's let everybody know what you won it for. Number one, what was the award exactly that you won, and for what
it's
coverage?
It's the Pulitzer Prize for local news, and it was for a series of stories we did last year on non-unanimous jury verdicts, the scheme in Louisiana that Louisiana shares with only one other state. Well, it doesn't share anymore, Oregon. And we showed, we built databases of trials and jurors, the outcome of what happened when jurors came to the court to be selected for trials. And we found a racial disparity in jury selection. We found it in the ways that people vote in the verdicts, and we found overall that this non-unanimous verdict scheme discriminated against black defendants.
And so your reporting came at a time, too, when there was legislation moving through the state legislature. This was last year.
Yeah, we
to eliminate
started
this non-unanimous jury.
We started our work in early 2017. J.P. Morrell, a Democrat of New Orleans, authored a bill just as we were finishing up all of our research that he really intended as a conversation starter. Like this is something we want to bring up and get the, I think JP's biggest hope was, that they'd appoint a task force and get to studying this. And then we sort of got off our duff because we weren't really paying a whole lot of attention to what they were doing. But we realized it would look pretty stupid for us to, for this thing to get killed in the legislature and then we come out a week later and say, oh, look at all these findings we have. So we rushed it in the paper, which is strange to talk about, but we, and that it really seemed to ignite something in Baton Rouge. You had the legislature that got on board, you had cheers in the House, and then it went to the voters. And this is really a testament to the voters of Louisiana.
And to the paper also, to informing the voters of Louisiana, so they understood it better.
Yeah, and they understood it, and they knew what they saw when they saw it, and they voted to get rid of it. And after that,
overwhelmingly.
Almost 2 to 1. It's 60 out of 63 parishes.
And it cut across party lines. It cut across.
Right.
That was the most amazing thing. It was like a left-right pincers movement campaign, and the right is really, I think, what pushed it over the top for sure. And it was just a fascinating thing to watch. That 3 weeks ago or a month ago, the U.S. Supreme Court has now granted cert to reconsider the constitutionality of non-unanimous jury verdicts, and then we got a Pulitzer Prize. So it's been a very nice.
And you got a Pulitzer Prize. Oh, by the way.
Now, when this was talked about, it was said that Louisiana, I think Oregon were the only states that didn't.
Correct, and now they're trying to change.
Okay, that's the question. Yeah.
They don't want to be the last.
Did you ever run into the argument? I mean, most of the time it's been presented as a racial argument, but did you ever run into the argument that 10-2 is good, and that sometimes you get people who can just vote contrary, you get contrarians, and so some people maybe who should be convicted, aren't because of that, or are?
Well, it actually makes 10-2 acquittals. You can't get a 10-2 acquittal anymore either. So it's kind of it works
That
both
cuts it,
ends.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, and there are jurors like that, and there are jurors. You know, the law says you need to get to 10. It doesn't say what those other two have to do, and you find in a lot of cases those two are essentially either they might be protest votes or they might be I don't have to decide, so I'm not going to decide on this man's fate, or so they'll just sort of bow out. So that The answer to that question is really 48 other states do it, and nobody's complained about that.
So back to the Pulitzer issue.
Please.
Did you guys know?
Carry on.
Yeah, you don't want to talk about it or anything, do you? But did you have an idea? Did you have an inkling? Where you all released a great video of the announcement, and obviously genuine joy.
Yeah, I think what happens is after the finalists they leak kind of a little bit out from all these judges are journalists, so it's really hard to keep things down. But the winners, we didn't know anything about that, so we had a TV screen set up, getting ready for the big disappointment. We go back to our task and get to work, and so it was really lovely. It was great to see everybody cheer because everybody deserves it, because we really have worked very hard to get this
hard work.
operation
That
going.
was really comprehensive, great reporting, which
you.
really had a direct impact on our way of life. So congratulations again to you.
And Ramon that day tweeted some nice
That's right.
praise for you guys.
Thank you, Ramon.
In the video, I am the one tackling John Zimmerman.
That's right. I was looking for you too. Yeah, Ramon. I mean, we sit right next to each other, and he watched me for 8 months entering data into spreadsheets while he's out running around covering murders and whatnot. So it was really nice to hold up our end of the bargain.
Yeah, and that's something I think for everybody to understand. It really is hard work. It's tedious work too, to come up with that kind of information and breakdown and data analysis for the reporting that you all do.
Yeah,
Well
the
deserved.
movie of this is me in my underwear, split screen with Gordon and whatever he's wearing, typing stuff into spreadsheets. It's riveting stuff.
I really don't know if we want to see that, John. But keep up the good reporting, though. Okay, E, back to you. Saints schedule announced.
Yeah, States used to be this is the kind of thing. It's just a routine thing. You announce your schedule, but now there's just so much you can read into these schedules now, especially the way that the season ended last year, with the Saints really one of the top-ranked teams in the NFL and could have very easily been the Super Bowl champ. But the new schedule has the Saints opening up on Monday Night Football game. I believe it's September 6th against the Texans in Dallas. The second week, though, is the one that the world's been waiting for. The Saints play the Rams. Now, to me, the fair thing would have been to have this game in New Orleans, because we were the victims of what happened last time they played the Rams. But it's going to be in Los Angeles, where they really don't care that much. But it's going to be the no-call bowl, okay, between the Saints and the Rams. That's to really be
No referees on the field.
It's going to really be a huge game. Well, it's going to be, the referees of that game, they could probably just take the bus because they all live in Los Angeles, okay? And so the no-call will be the second week. And then the third week is also on the West Coast. That's going to be Seattle against the Seahawks. And so you have 3 playoff teams that are there the first 3 weeks. And supposedly the Saints can just stay there that week between the Rams and Seattle. And so it's a very, very difficult start. It gets a little bit easier toward midseason. But if the Saints come out that first 4 weeks or so, 3-1, or that's going to be a good sign that they have a good team. But there should be, all indications are this will be a good year for the team.
Yeah, a lot of the playoff teams. I guess the other side of the coin is a lot of the playoff teams don't return to the playoffs the following season. I think the NFL is built that way. The Saints were an exception last year to do that. So I guess the hope is that maybe a couple of those teams in the early part of the schedule don't match up. But that's just another way to look at it if you're an optimist.
And they're clearly the best team in their. They're clearly the best team in their division, and so they should. I mean, that should help in terms of getting the playoffs too.
A lot of important pieces are coming back, and they've upgraded at the tight end position, which if you had a good tight end in that NFC title game, maybe it isn't so close at the end of the game. But we'll see.
So anyway, it's something that hit me, and believe me, I'm not a big sports person, but I certainly love the Saints, is that, I heard a commentator say, it's kind of the first 4 games are a really rough schedule because of all these teams. There's no guarantee those teams are going to be as good. The Saints are, we know that, but not necessarily the others, right?
It's hard. I mean, it's still the roster building process is really early, right? You still don't know how teams fare in the draft. training camp can alter the fate of, depending on how healthy you get through training camp and preseason, can alter the fate of your season. So it's early, but you can read. Yeah, you can read a lot into the schedule, but hopefully it works out for the Saints.
Well, yes, indeed. Okay, real quick, Ramon, we're going to have you touch again on. We heard more news this past week about lawsuits against clergy alleging sexual abuse.
Yes, and the two very kind of similar complaints. One against a priest who's a late priest that taught at Jesuit High School, and then another one against a still living priest at St. Joseph, and who was teaching at St. Joseph and Gretna. Lawrence Hecker and Edward DeRussi are their names respectively. Similar in that they're allegations that date back to the late 1960s, but they were prompted. The accusers were prompted to come forward by seeing their names on the list of credibly accused priests who were clergy who were credibly accused of sexual abuse. But that were released by the Archdiocese of New Orleans, and then as well by the Jesuit order a little later. And so I think it's. They're starting to bunch up. I mean, I think this was a possibility that I think the Catholic Church foresaw in New Orleans, but they still went forward with the release, saying that it was time for a full accounting. But it is going to be, I think there's going to be some questions as far as how these double-digit, I think, lawsuits at this point kind of play out, if they result in settlements, how much the settlements are for, and what effect it may have, I think, financially on the church. But, to the Archbishop Gregory Amon's, credit, he, knowing that this was a possibility, went forth anyway, despite some there's obviously a very important and strong debate about the completion of the list and how much information was in the list and how useful the information in the list was, but they still went forward anyway, calling for a full accounting, and so I think we're starting to get a better idea of the full scope of the problem, I think, but obviously there's so many unanswered questions still.
And so New Orleans released the list, Baton Rouge to Lafayette also?
Yes. I think at this stage we were, before the show, we were discussing that. I think at this stage most of the dioceses in Louisiana have done it following New Orleans' lead. There may be one that hasn't, but...
And an archbishop is the bishop among bishops. He's a little bit higher up, and so all the other bishops within the Archdiocese of New Orleans, I think, they look to the Archbishop for lead, as I think happened in this case. And now he's acting also as interim Bishop for Alexandria. Yes, and there was rumors that, I think he acknowledged rumors in NOLA.com that he was up for consideration for the post in Washington, D.C. That went to someone else.
All righty, Ramon, thanks a lot. Errol, over to you. We saw, of course, the tragic fire in Paris at Notre Dame Cathedral. And it sort of brought to mind some other fires that have happened. Well, the first thing that came to mind was the fire in 1988 of the Cabildo, which of course is right next door to our cathedral. And the similarities is that they're both beloved and famous historic buildings. And they both, the Cabildo fire has been established. It was started because of an accident with a welder's torch. I think they work on a gutter or something. Apparently, the Notre Dame fire is an accident also, construction accident. But both of them are sort of like rooftop fires. And they both caused just a whole lot of reaction. And they both had this kind of like quick reaction in the same way within hours, people are saying, we will rebuild, we will save it. The next day, there were community drives that were starting. And so I think it happens when you have this really beloved public facility that people want to respond. And indeed, it did happen that they, I don't remember how long it took, but the top level of the Cabildo was destroyed. Yeah, the cupola. Yeah, and that's the other thing. Before that fire, people in New Orleans did not know the word cupola. Okay, they thought, hey, that thing on the top is starting to burn. Okay, that fire thought New Orleans the word cupola, which came in handy a few years later when the fairgrounds had its fire, because it had several cupolas on the top, so people were able to say, there goes the cupola. And so we know that word because of that fire. Now, but we don't want to say it in reference to fire anymore. But the biggest fire of all time was exactly 200 years before the Cabildo fire. That was the fire of 1788. It started at a home
in the French Quarter near Jackson Square, the Place d'Armes at the time, and it spread quickly. There were something like 1,100 buildings in the quarter at the time. 856 of them were destroyed by this fire, which spread rapidly. That was the one that was on Good Friday. And sort of like the irony is that there was a tradition that on Good Friday, well, there still is on Good Friday, they cover the statues within the church, but also they silence the bells, and you don't ring bells on Good Friday. And so, but bells were an emergency warning system back then, but the priests refused to ring bells to announce that there was a fire. And so that made the whole thing even worse. And in 1794, there was another fire. At that time, 212 buildings were destroyed. By then, both these fires were during the Spanish rule. And the Spanish by this time said, we got to do things differently. And the buildings, all of them were wooden buildings built in the French style. And the Spanish started rebuilding them. And they used buildings of masonry. And you started seeing the wrought iron balconies and things that didn't burn easily. And so that was the beginning of really the Spanish architecture style that you see in the French Quarter after 1794. And Don Almonaster financed just about all of this work. So.
Yeah, so fires really did play a big part in our history. And of course, just recently we saw that fire in the Grand Mansion on St. Charles Avenue, the Rex Mansion too, that had everybody out there, just looking in horror.
Yeah, at least Notre Dame, they were able to save a lot. And apparently, not with the Grace Mansion, that they've turned down the whole thing now. We still don't know in terms of collectibles what all was saved from that, but they did do a lot with the Notre Dame.
Notre Dame, yes, some very valuable and important religious relics, and then other art pieces and artifacts, but still so horrible to seeing the flames leap through that roof and seeing the steeple fall, and not to mention the Twin Towers in New York, too. People were feeling that same emotion.
And the point's been made, it's not mine, that there's a lot of disunity in France now. There's a lot of political problems, right. But at least for a few days, people in France on all sides seem to be united about this. Even if they didn't appreciate the building for its religious significance, they appreciate it for its art and cultural significance.
For its historical significance, too. Okay, real quick, looking ahead.
May 15th, the extended best-of sculpture garden in City Park opens. And it's going to really be something to behold. They really did some nice work with walkways over lagoons and really nice. And not far away is the still being completed Children's Museum, which will open in the fall. So that's going to be a great spot.
It will be really, really lovely. John?
Well, different jury issue, but in Baton Rouge, the Louisiana Supreme Court just halted a capital murder trial because of a snafu in the computer system there that for the last 8 years has left any young people off the jury rolls.
Really?
And so what happens next in the future cases or in cases that have been tried already is the question going forward.
Interesting.
The scion of a tight-knit New Orleans East family will be fighting for a world boxing championship on April 27th in Lafayette. We will have a story on Sunday in The Advocate chronicling how they got to this moment together.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, guys, for being here. Thank you all for joining us. Have a very happy Easter, a happy Passover. Have a wonderful weekend. We'll see you again next week for Informed Sources, and have a good evening now.